Today we're out in South Carolina taking a look at the all-new 2018 Chevy Equinox. Forget everything that you know about the Chevy Equinox because this is an entirely different formula versus the 2017 model. The 2017 Equinox was sort of a half step between the mid-size two-row crossover segment and the compact two-row crossover segment. However, just like we see with the new GMC Acadia, General Motors has actually shrunk the Equinox, and this is now almost exactly the same size as a Toyota RAV4. That should help the Equinox compete head-on in this very competitive compact crossover segment, where we also find the recently refreshed Nissan Rogue and the all-new Honda CR-V. Helping the Chevy compete with that tough competition, they've also put this on a crash diet, and this is about 400 pounds lighter than the last generation Equinox. All models get projector headlamps, base models get halogen projector headlamps, mid-level trims get HID projector headlamps, and top-end models get LED headlamps. Our model is the top-end version, so we do have those LED lamps. We also have fog lamps right down below. There's an LED daytime running lamp strip inside the headlamp module, and of course we have this latest version of the Chevy grille. One thing you won't find up front, however, is a radar adaptive cruise control sensor in this particular model, although we do have a 360-degree camera system, cameras placed right here in the middle of this new grille. The 2018 model is 4.7 inches shorter than the 2017 model, putting this at 183.1 inches long, just a hair shorter than a RAV4. That puts this squarely between the Nissan Rogue on the large end and the Honda CR-V on the small end of this competitive segment. If you recall, the last Equinox was perhaps a little bit more Ford Edge sized than Honda CR-V sized. Chevy's made a big deal about the vehicle losing weight and losing size but retaining the cargo capacity of its predecessor, but we actually find a little bit less cargo room back here than you will find in the RAV4, the CR-V, or the Rogue. However, we do have a very competitive rear passenger area with a decent amount of headroom and a good deal of legroom. Out back, we have hidden exhaust tips, which is kind of an interesting touch in this particular segment, well-integrated parking sensors, and a nice feature is that we actually have a slight ridge here running all the way from this lower part of the bumper all the way on up here. This ridge or spine design mirrors what we see on the front of the vehicle and the vehicle's hood. At first, there will only be one engine available under the hood, this brand new 1.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. This engine produces 170 horsepower and 203 pound-feet of torque, which is fairly torquey for an engine this size. This is basically the same engine that we find in a variety of other Chevy models and replaces their base naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine. At the moment, this engine is mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission, and you can get either front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Later this year, we will see a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine as the top-end engine choice that will produce 252 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. That's very similar to what we see in the current generation Cadillac ATS, and that will be mated to an all-new 9-speed automatic transmission. Also later this year, we'll see a brand new 1.6-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged diesel option that will produce 137 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. Interestingly enough, that engine will be mated to a 6-speed auto, not the 9-speed auto that we see in the 2-liter turbo. Fuel economy comes in at 28 miles per gallon in the front-wheel drive trim, which is what we're driving right here, 26 if you choose the all-wheel drive option and the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. EPA fuel economy estimates are not available yet for the 2-liter turbocharged engine or the upcoming diesel engine, but I expect them to come in around 26 miles per gallon combined for the front-wheel drive 2-liter turbo model, 25 for the all-wheel drive, probably around 33 and 31 for the diesel engines. The tow rating varies based on which engine you choose and what other options you select on the Equinox, but it will top out at around 3,500 pounds with the 2-liter turbocharged engine. They haven't announced any definite numbers with the 1.6-liter diesel, but I expect those numbers to be pretty similar to the 1.5-liter turbo model. Front seat comfort in the Equinox is very good. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion. We also have softly padded seats. One thing I like is that the seat bottom cushion appears to be just a little bit longer than we find in the Ford Escape, making it a little bit more comfortable for taller drivers or taller passengers. Our model has a power driver's seat with a 2-way adjustable lumbar support, and the passenger seat has the same way of motion as the driver. One thing worth noting is that the power driver's seat is not standard until you get to the very top end trims of the Equinox, although it is optional on most trims. With the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, rear legroom is very generous. I have about 6 or 7 inches left. In the real world, this vehicle has more combined legroom than the average entry in this segment for sure. In addition to that, I have about ½ an inch of headroom, even though our model has the optional panoramic sunroof, which does cut down on rear seat headroom. A nice touch in the Equinox for taller drivers or taller passengers is that the sunroof is optional even in the top-end trims. And a lot of the competition, you are forced to get the sunroof if you want those top-end trims, which cuts down on headroom. Moving over to the middle seat, I get slightly less headroom. My head just barely touches the ceiling, but this is still a good performance for a compact crossover. A nice touch in the rear seat is that the shoulder belt actually comes out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling like we find in a lot of the Japanese competition. That makes it easier to put child seats in the back and not have them skewed to one side or the other. They'll sit very centered in the rear seat back. Unlike the last generation Equinox, this generation has rear seats that fold completely flat with the cargo area in the rear, because you'll notice the seat bottom cushion moves out of the way a little bit. Behind the cargo hatch, we find 29 cubic feet of storage space. That's about 10 cubic feet behind the leaders in this segment, which would be the RAV4, the CR-V, and the Nissan Rogue. However, the storage area is larger and more practical than the smaller entries like the Sportage and the Tucson. Under the cargo area load floor, we find some additional storage room. You can actually take the load floor completely out of the vehicle, although this doesn't have two different steps like we find in some of the competition. If you're wondering where the spare tire is located, that's actually under the second cargo area divider, and that's where we find the optional temporary spare tire. Not all models have it, but most trims will. Improving cargo practicality, the rear seats can be folded from either the back of the rear seat themselves or from right back here in the cargo area. On the inside, we find fixed height seat belts for both the driver and the front passenger, and two-way adjustable headrests. The model we're driving has this contrasting two-tone, sort of brown and black leather upholstery. This is perforated because the seats are both heated and ventilated. The front doors are a combination of soft touch plastics and hard touch plastics with sort of a unique coating on them to make them feel a little bit more premium. So you'll find those hard plastics with the coating right up here in this black section, soft plastics in this entire tan section, and then standard hard plastics lower on the door around this bottle holder and the speaker grille. As we move from the doors on over to the dashboard, you'll definitely notice a greater attention to detail inside this cabin than in the previous generation of the Equinox. The dashboard has stitched material inserts. These mirror what we see on the seats with a solid section and then a perforated section below that. As we see on the doors, the upper portion of the dashboard in the charcoal color and then the lower portion of the dashboard again in the charcoal color are those hard plastics with that coating to make them feel a little bit more premium. On the passenger side, we find a moderately sized glove compartment. I was not able to fit a large tablet computer inside, however small tablet computers would be fine. In the center of the dashboard, we find the touchscreen infotainment system. Ours is the optional 8-inch system. There is a 7-inch system that is standard in all models of the Equinox. That's kind of a unique feature because in most of the competition, a touchscreen infotainment system is not standard. In addition to the touchscreen being standard, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration and OnStar are all standard, even in the base L model. If you opt for the larger 8-inch color touchscreen, then factory navigation becomes an option. On either side of that, we have two large air vents. Below that, we find some physical controls for the audio system, a home button, forward, backward, volume and power, and then a fixed back knob. Below that, we find the controls for the dual zone climate control. This system is optional, not standard. Below the climate controls, we find two USB inputs, an auxiliary input, 12-volt power port, and an optional charging mat for your smartphone. Certain Android phones are available from the factory with this particular charging standard, but Apple's iPhones are not. Continuing back from that, we have a fairly traditional console shifter. Low mode is all the way to the back, and that activates these manual mode buttons right here on top of the shifter. Behind that, we have an electric parking brake and then two large cup holders. Between the front seats, we find a small storage cubby right in front of this padded center armrest, and large and very deep storage well right here between the front seats. Inside this storage area, we find two additional USB ports. On the driver's side, we have a black-face instrument cluster with red dials and white numbers. We have a tachometer over here on the left, a speedometer on the right, with physical fuel gauge and physical engine temperature gauge above this multifunction information display. The multifunction display runs the same basic software that we see in a wide variety of General Motors vehicles and gives us things like our trip computer information, including oil life, tire pressure, fuel economy, and if you opt for the model with forward collision warning, it'll also give you the following distance between you and the vehicle in front of you. In addition to that, we have an audio system interface that allows you full browse capability of certain media devices, a Bluetooth phone interface, navigation interface that gives you turn-by-turn directions, and the ability to change certain vehicle settings. The three-spoke steering wheel is similar to what we see in other Chevy models. We have sport grips right up top. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find the buttons for the lane keeping assistance system as well as the heated steering wheel. Although this looks like a radar adaptive cruise control system, the middle button only affects the forward collision warning because we do not actually have adaptive cruise control in this model at this time. On the right side of the steering wheel, we have a voice command button, a mute button, and the buttons to control that multifunction display between the speedometer and the tachometer. Audio system controls are found behind the steering wheel, so we have volume up and down on the right side of the steering wheel, and then track up and down on the left. In terms of acceleration, keep in mind that our numbers are preliminary because we haven't been testing this on our own home test track, but we ran from 0 to 60 in about 9.5 seconds. That would make the Equinox one of the slower entries in this segment. Keep in mind we are driving the base 1.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo. This engine is mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission, not the new 9-speed that we've been hearing about in the Equinox. That's not coming until the 2-liter turbo. Interestingly enough, they're not going to put that 9-speed automatic behind the 1.5-liter turbo or the 1.6-liter turbocharged diesel engine at this time. I suspect if GM mated the 9-speed automatic with this 1.5-liter turbo, that the acceleration times would definitely improve because the 0 to 30 time in this vehicle is definitely below the CR-V and the Nissan Rogue. We haven't had a chance to do our typical 60 to 0 braking testing. However, because of the curb weight, I suspect this will be very similar to the Honda CR-V. This actually ends up being slightly lighter than the CR-V in most forms. Although the base Equinox is actually a little bit heavier than the base CR-V, remember that the CR-V starts with a 2.4-liter naturally aspirated engine, not the new 1.5-liter turbo. So although this is 20 pounds heavier than the base CR-V, by the time you take a look at this versus the base 1.5-liter version of the CR-V, this actually ends up being about 60 pounds lighter. Light curb weight is everything because light curb weight helps improve your braking times, it helps improve your acceleration times, and it helps improve the handling score. We are driving the top-end Premier trim of this vehicle right now out on the road. This has the optional 235 with tires. I think that overall handling ability is just a little bit better than the CR-V and perhaps a little bit behind the Volkswagen Tiguan. GM is not giving the Equinox their Hyperstrut front suspension, which is available in the closely related Buick Envision, so that does put this just a little bit behind that Buick in terms of overall handling ability out on the road. An interesting touch is that GM has actually given this a rack-mounted electric power steering system, and that does help improve feel versus some of the column-mounted units we find in vehicles like the Kia Sportage. In terms of overall suspension tuning, this is very middle of the road. This is neither as hard as something like a Volkswagen Tiguan in its top-end trims, nor quite as soft as a Nissan Rogue, but it is still very compliant for highway driving. In their presentation this morning, General Motors talked a lot about their new chassis design, especially the fact that this is more rigid and lighter than the last generation Equinox. They've also made some structural improvements in order to help improve handling specifically. GM has also addressed the cabin noise in the Equinox. This does seem a little bit quieter than the last model we tested, but it's not the quietest in the segment. I would say this is fairly average in terms of overall cabin noise. Fuel economy ratings are official for the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. This will average 28 miles per gallon in the front-wheel drive trim, 27 in the all-wheel drive trim. That does put this 1 mile per gallon below the 1.5-liter turbo in the Honda CR-V. The likely reason for that is that we don't have a CVT under the hood, we have a traditional 6-speed automatic transmission. On the one hand, this will feel a little bit more traditional out on the road because of that automatic transmission. On the downside, it will be a little bit less efficient. Now, the fuel economy ratings on the 2-liter turbo are not official yet, but General Motors tells us to expect at least 1 mile per gallon lower fuel economy in that turbo versus this one. The diesel will really be the fuel economy champ in this segment. They're expecting it to get over 40 miles per gallon on the highway. It's probably going to be in the mid-30s in terms of combined fuel economy, and that will be definitely the most efficient engine in this segment that's not a hybrid. The Equinox has a good solid feel out on the road. I'd say this is definitely a solid competitor to the class leaders in this particular segment. The 1.5-liter turbo is definitely an asset. Even though the 0 to 60 acceleration is not as fast as I would like it to be, the overall driving feel is excellent in terms of passing ability and hill climbing ability. Because this engine produces so much torque down there at 2,000 RPM, notably more than we find in the Honda CR-V, the transmission doesn't have to downshift as often as we find in some of the competition in order to climb hills. So this feels a little bit more relaxed when you're hill climbing than something like a RAV4, which is definitely going to have to downshift more in order to get up those slopes. For 2018, the Equinox starts at $23,580. That price includes the 7-inch LCD infotainment system with standard Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. CarPlay and Android Auto, the 7-inch LCD, and the turbocharged engine are options that we don't find in the base Honda CR-V. So the base model of Chevy Equinox actually ends up being a very good value versus the base version of the CR-V, even though this doesn't include a few of the features that we do find over there on the Honda. There aren't too many options available in the base LS trim. If you want to add some of those option packages that we see on this vehicle, you do have to step up to those upper trim levels. The next step up is the LT trim at $26,750. That competes fairly well with the Honda EX. However, the Honda EX gives you radar adaptive cruise control and their advanced safety systems, and you don't find that on the LT trim of the Equinox, although we do get a power driver's seat, the HID headlamps, and the tinted glass that we're seeing in this model. The Equinox Premier is the model that we've been driving most of the day today, and that started at $30,790. The model that we've been driving here, which is a front-wheel drive model with the 1.5-liter turbo engine, and basically every option available, was around $37,000. If you were to add all-wheel drive to this and every option, you'd end up right around $39,000. $39,000 is one of the more expensive entries in this particular segment, although we do find a few features inside the Equinox that we don't find in top-end trims of the competition. At this point in time, we don't know what the 2-liter turbo or the 1.6-liter diesel will set you back, but I would expect them to add at least $2,000 to the price tag of the Equinox. That means that although the Equinox has one of the lower base prices in this segment, it will also have one of the higher top-end prices if you choose those optional engines. You will of course have to wait until we can get our hands on a Chevy Equinox for our complete review, as well as our detailed comparison section, where we'll pit this against the RAV4, the CR-V, the Rogue, and the Escape. But Chevy must be doing something right, because the Equinox is already the 5th best-selling vehicle in this segment, even though the old Equinox was getting on a bit. In fact, if you add the GMC Terrain to the Chevy Equinox sales, this is actually the 2nd best-selling entry in the segment. I think the reason for that is that the Equinox is a very good all-around vehicle. We have very good fuel economy from this 1.5-liter turbocharged engine. It matches the fuel economy that we find in the base Honda CR-V, even though the Honda CR-V uses a continuously variable transmission, and this uses an older 6-speed transmission. If you opt for the most fuel-efficient version of the Honda CR-V, it only beats the Equinox by 1 mile per gallon. This is definitely ahead of the Toyota RAV4 when it comes to fuel economy and actually 0 to 60 performance as well. Chevy is definitely up their game for 2018. The Equinox has lost a significant amount of weight in this generation, and that really improves the handling ability and the handling feel out on the road. It now makes the Equinox one of the better handling options in this segment. I would say this still doesn't have the feel of the Mazda CX-5 or the absolute grip of the top-end Volkswagen Tiguan, but this does very, very well for itself when you pit this against the Ford Escape. That puts the Equinox notably above the Nissan Rogue and the Toyota RAV4 when it comes to handling, and I would say just a smidge above the Honda CR-V as well. In addition to that, Chevy will continue to offer a more powerful engine option in the upcoming 2-liter turbocharged engine with the new 9-speed automatic, and that new diesel engine, which will definitely compete with the new diesel from the Mazda CX-5. Add to that a much more refined interior and better standard infotainment, and it's easy to see why the Equinox is going to be very competitive with the competition, especially in base trims. Unfortunately, as you work your way up the trim lines, I think the value proposition starts to fall apart just a little bit for the Equinox, especially in the top-end trim that we're driving right here. This is about $37,000 for this model, about $39,000 if you were to get this model with all-wheel drive. That is significantly more than a CR-V Touring. Now keep in mind that we are driving the model with the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine under the hood. Very soon we will see a 2-liter turbocharged engine in the top-end models. I think that's going to be an entirely different game. It will also be a very different game when we see the diesel engine under the hood, because the diesel fuel economy is going to rival the hybrid fuel economy from the hybrid RAV4 and the hybrid Nissan Rogue, and they're not that far off this in terms of overall pricing. If you do an awful lot of highway driving, definitely wait for the diesel engine under this hood. You're going to be getting the best fuel economy in this segment by a large margin. Again, be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen so you can be updated on our full review when that comes out. Hopefully we will also be able to get our hands on the 2-liter turbocharged model with the new 9-speed very soon. In the meantime, be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos. You can go to patreon.com and support this channel, and I'll see you next week.